Hello, and welcome to This Conversation Matters, a weekly show about the social issues shaping our communities, from race and inequality to justice, economic opportunity, and overall well-being. I'm Sheree Curry. Each week, I speak with experts and people with lived experience to help you better understand why these issues matter in our lives. So today on This Conversation Matters, I am speaking with my mom, Vera Curry James, in honor of Mother's Day. Welcome, Mom.
Hi, Sheree. Thank you.
Okay, and so today we're going to talk a little bit about your life, what it was like. You grew up in Alabama. We'll talk specifically about where, and your time moving to Chicago. I was born in Chicago. And so let's kind of like start a little bit from the beginning. Where exactly in Alabama did you grow up? And you were born in the late 1940s. You can say what year if you want.
I grew up in a small town about 40 miles north of Mobile, Alabama.
And you are about the middle child of 11. What number are you?
I'm the fourth daughter.
Fourth child and the fourth daughter, which means all of your brothers are younger than you.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And not everybody was born in Alabama. I don't believe the youngest, but you grew up also not too far from your grandmother and with your parents. Tell me a little bit about what your neighborhood was like, what your home was like as a child.
We were all family. It was relatives, cousins, aunties, uncles, the neighbors there, they were relatives. It was a family, a community of family.
Really walking distance, because I would go to Alabama as a child for summers, and walking distance, from my grandmother's house to my great grandmother's house, right? There was just a stone throws away, literally, but other relatives there. So that was the same way for you growing up. Everybody was just right there. A lot of people right there on the same street, same neighborhood.
When you think about city blocks, we were across the street from each other. But the houses were not next door to each other. Because of the land, the houses were not close to each other, but 2-3 houses apart.
Yeah, so
Right.
more space between
between
it in terms of acreage. Yeah. And tell me about the actual housing structure itself, because again, we're talking about the 1940s in Alabama. Know that Mama Letha, as we called my great grandmother, your grandmother, lived in the house that your grandfather built for his wife, and then his daughter, my great grandmother, lived there later in life. Tell me a little bit about the structures between her house and the house that you actually grew up in.
If I talk about my grandmother's house, it was 3 bedrooms, dining room, and a small kitchen, outdoor toilet, front porch, back porch. And what we would say across the road or across the street would be where I grew up. My parents' home was a 3-bedroom house, but no dining room. We had an enclosed back porch, which was the laundry area. The front porch was not enclosed. You could play in the yard. We had outdoor toilets. But
And when you talk about the number of bedroom, this is still a single story home. This was not a 2-story.
right. Oh yeah, just single story.
And I remember the water pump in the front yard of Mama Letha's house. So there was a well on the property. Uh, at some point there was running water inside the house, but I do remember the water pump.
Yeah, they no longer use that pump because they had running water inside.
Mhm.
it was still there on the property.
And the town itself, so even though up and down that street we had a lot of relatives, how integrated was the town of Perdido? What was the town center like?
Well, our community was all Black and definitely did not live in walking distance to each other. The whites and Black did not.
Where the whites lived, it was all white.
Mm, correct.
And so schools. So we think about this again. We know when Brown versus Board of Education that, integrated schools across the country, but this was particularly, that we know about from the South as well. Well, it came out of Topeka, Brown versus Board of Education, but that impact, especially on the South, with segregated schools, and that was 1954. So around the time that you would have been starting about first grade or so.
Correct. Schools were not integrated at all at the time that I lived in Alabama.
So despite Brown versus Board of Education coming in 1954 when you were about 6 or 7 years old, and your part, they were still segregated schools.
Correct.
Okay. And do you remember any conversation around that in terms of or why that was? Well, I guess it's what you're used to. Like I said, it's different neighborhoods, so your school's in your neighborhood, and maybe you're not even really thinking about that as a child. But given what was going on with the early stages of the civil rights movement, what might you have heard?
There was really no discussion about why the Black children went to a separate school, even though the school where the white children went was closer to where I lived. We still had to, the school bus drove past their school to take us to our school, which was 14 miles away. And where theirs might have been 3 miles from where I lived.
Okay. So you were not going to school in your neighborhood. You were going to school in somebody else's neighborhood 14 miles away.
Right. That's where the Black school was for that area.
And what was the school itself like? Was these one-room schoolhouses? Were these five-room schoolhouses? Was it a bigger school than that?
No, one building. So I believe first through third was in one building, fourth, fifth, and sixth in another, and then 7 through 12 in a different building.
Okay. And you left, your family moved to Chicago when you were in what grade?
I had completed ninth, so I was in 10th grade, 11th grade. I had completed 10th grade, so did 11th and 12th grade in Chicago.
Okay. And before we go to speak more about Chicago, I'm go back a little bit to Alabama in terms of when you would go into the city to shop, when you're with your parents or your older siblings. Tell me about that, because again, this was also an era of separate water fountains. You couldn't walk through the same door to order food, from a restaurant or whatever. Tell us a little bit about some of those particulars.
Well, definitely you could buy food from the same restaurant, but there was a back entrance for Black and a front entrance for whites. So if you picture a city street where a restaurant is built in the front, is on the street, the whites went in there, and the Blacks had to go through what we would call the alley doors. You went from the back. You order from the same people, same food, but at different entrance. The water fountains, of course, as you see on TV, were labeled white and Black.
Okay.
colored at that time. But at that time, you thought nothing about it because that was the standard.
Yeah. Um, in terms of the restaurant owners, shop owners, were some of them, some stores like this owned by blacks and was still front and back separate entrances?
I cannot recall any blacks owning any department stores, any stores. Now, I did have a aunt and uncle that owned a store in our community where we lived, and they sold like a small grocery store for us kids. It was going in to buy ice cream and candy or whatever as any kid would buy. But they did sell things on the shelves, the canned goods, bread, milk, meat. And my uncle had a pickup truck, so he would have to go into the larger town to pick up these items to sell in his store. That was my mother's sister and her husband that owned the store.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about, again, like as a child, especially as you got to be older, middle school is a little bit different than elementary. But was there conversation in the family or even in the neighborhood about why it is that you had to go and order through a back door? I mean, I know certain things can become, they're just ingrained. You do them because it's always been done. That's what you would have known growing up. Did the adults around you talk about why this was or any kind of change that they wanted to see?
Never heard any of those conversations at all. And I can tell you that the parents during that time period, they probably had adult conversations, and the children didn't stand around. They didn't have those type of conversations around their children. And if the adults were there talking, the children didn't hang around. They were off doing childlike things. So I really can't say how our parents talked about segregation. I really don't know.
Right. And then when we think about, this was again the 1950s by this point, and television was not as prevalent as it is today. We didn't get our news the same way. There wasn't even all these different channels on the radio dial. So, which would have been, so much easier today for elementary school kids to get their news, whether they're getting it from the internet, from Instagram and TikTok and so forth. The primary way at that time, right, would have been the newspaper. Maybe you listen to some things in general that came on the radio. Tell me a little bit about media and consuming media as a child.
Well, we had a TV, and I cannot recall as a kid really sitting and listening to the news. Maybe my parents did, mother and daddy did, but I don't recall sitting down to listen to the news.
What's your earliest memory of the civil rights movement of Dr. Martin Luther King or other civil rights leaders?
Well, even when the things were happening in Selma or other places, we didn't hear about it. There was no discussion about it. Not until I was 16 and living in Chicago, really didn't discuss it. The schools were segregated, the stores were segregated as far as how when you went shopping, the clerks would approach the whites first. Even at the theater, there was one theater that I remember us going to, the upstairs, the balcony area, blacks paid at the same window, but you had to go upstairs to watch the movie at the theater. And I don't remember any black person having given birth at a hospital. My grandmother, my mom's mother, was a midwife, and a lot of the white women didn't go to hospitals. My grandmother delivered babies for the white and black mothers.
And she kept a very good log of all the children that she delivered, almost like this, the historian in a sense, also in terms of this log when people want to know who their, maybe a date that a sibling was born or who a parent was, if they were a child that was adopted away or whatever, right? They could go to Mamalita's. Tell me a little bit about that. She kept the
She
logs.
kept a log of all the babies that she delivered. I
Mhm.
can't remember which one of her, whether it was my uncle that lived in Indiana, Kentucky. Maybe he and his wife got the log, who got the log when she passed away, because she was living with them at the time she passed away.
Right, at 101 years old,
Correct.
which was right after she passed away, right after I finished graduate school, if I recall. A question for you, which actually I never asked but always assumed. So did she deliver you?
Actually, she did not, but her friend, I'm going to say her girlfriend, delivered me, and because my grandma was away at a conference.
Okay.
She was had a position within the Methodist denomination, and she would often go away to conferences. She was away at a conference. The reason a friend of hers delivered.
Okay. Yeah, I never knew that for sure. Okay. When the family moved to Chicago, when you were right after your 10th year of high school, south side of Chicago, tell me a little bit about that neighborhood and the school that you went to as well.
Well, the neighborhood was not integrated, but the high school I went to, which was a 3 blocks, maybe 4 block walk, was integrated, very integrated. But yet Chicago was divided. The people east of the street where my school was were Caucasians or other, except west of where the school was African American.
And this was about 1963. So what was it like then going from an all black small school to a much larger integrated school? What do you remember thinking?
It was a difficult adjustment for me because I wasn't accustomed to so many children in a school. It was a very large school. The integrated part didn't bother me so much because they had a way of still keeping the students separated because of the way they structured the classes. They had what they call essential classes, regular, and honors. They put most black children, black students in what they call essential classes. And you had a few in honors classes. For the most part, the black children were placed in regular, and especially if you came from out of state, a southern state.
Okay.
You had to really push for your right placement, and I because I had to do it for myself because my mother and daddy didn't come to the school to they went to register me, and so the rest, if I thought I was misplaced or I had to just kind of um, be my own spokesperson to have things right for me at school.
Okay. And the name of the school?
Hyde Park High School, and then it later was changed to Hyde Park Academy, but it was Hyde Park High School at the time.
Yeah. And I want to note that Hyde Park is the area where University of Chicago sits. Hyde Park is the area not far from how people know that Barack Obama lived when he was senator in Illinois. Anything else about the general area?
Well, it's on Stony Island Avenue, east of Stony Island Avenue. At that time in the 60s, were majority other. I'll say white and other. And west of Stony Island were majority black.
And you became an educator, an elementary school teacher, a principal, later also teaching in higher ed. What was your influence? Was there a person? What made you want to become a teacher?
Well, I have to go back to Alabama, and it was probably my fourth grade teacher who encouraged me and had me helping students in the class who Now we use the term they might have been struggling, and she would have me to help them. So I want to say my first influence came from my fourth grade teacher. And then later on, coming to Chicago and seeing the difficulties at Hyde Park High School, so many struggling students. And they had a tendency to place black children. I didn't know that at that time in classes that you were struggling, but there was not a lot of help for you. So I think that my motivation started early on, fourth grade, and then coming to Hyde Park High School and saw the need. I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to teach and I want to help struggling students. So that's how my first degree was in regular ed and special ed, the combination. And I chose to work with students labeled special needs students.
And in terms of like licensing, that was your right. That was your specialty, right? And in special education at the start of your teaching career.
Right.
Okay. And so, how would you compare as the years went on? Let's say how the education system in Chicago was from when you attended the last 2 years of your high school years to what you saw a couple decades later, when you became a principal. What do we see a change about the needs of the students or how the schools were funded?
Well, I believe it was the federal government at that time to start to bring about quality in education, quality for all children. And I think more funding went in to help the struggling children. They would separate the special needs students from the regular students, but there was an opportunity for them to come out of those special needs class if they had the right teacher. They could come out of the special needs classrooms into regular ed and then into honors classes. But it was definitely some federal changes that helped. Once the schools were integrated all over, then the federal funding did come out to help struggling schools, because some of the schools were struggling. All of the students in there were struggling, but then in Chicago, they began to do more integrating of teachers, integrating of students. So the changes came about because, the integrating of schools, the funding that went in.
And so let's talk a little bit about why it's important, if you feel it's important, to have integrated classrooms and having the teachers also of different races in a classroom. I'll use a little bit of an example. Right, for me, as elementary school, well, I'll go with fourth grade to eighth grade, was 100% Black students. There were a couple of white teachers, mostly nuns, at that time, compared to my K through third grade, 100% Black students, 100% Black teachers. And then going into high school, integrated student body, a majority white teachers, some Latino teachers, probably not more than two Black teachers at high school. And for where you were teaching and the differences that you saw as things started to change, why is that? Why was that important then? And maybe why is it important now? And how far have we come, or have we come very far?
It was necessary. The change was necessary. And let me speak first for you about you and your sister. I wanted you guys in an integrated high school because you had gone to a segregated elementary school. And so I purposely chose an integrated high school because, I mean, the world is integrated and you wouldn't always be in a shell. So I think, as far as the government, the more they began to integrate the staff, the teachers and the staff, so that they could understand the culture. They needed to interact with them. So some of the children that you grew up with didn't go to a integrated school all the way through elementary and high school.
The
But
neighborhoods weren't integrated because, like, where we grew up in primarily two different neighborhoods as I was growing up, still 100% black, 99.9% black um, neighborhoods. And so, yeah, so the only integration really came would have been through that high school experience. And in a sense, now I'm thinking about it mirroring your experience because you were in 100% black elementary, and it wasn't until part of your high school experience that became integrated. And so then for me and Samantha, my oldest sister, for us being in the integrated high school as well after that elementary school experience.
no, I don't know if I lost your question.
It wasn't really a question. It was just really a statement, just me observing how we kind of mirrored your experience of
Mhm.
it not being until high school that we had the integrated student body. And maybe that was you saying you saw that as something important because society is integrated, part of the life lesson that you learn, through your life, but maybe how much of that also because you did have that experience in high school and knowing that it was important not to wait post high school, but to have some of that experience in high school. Was it a little bit because of your high school experience, or was it just really just because life in general?
Probably a combination of both. You just cannot go through life without interacting with other ethnic groups. And if I may interject this thought that when I taught, I'm going to say it was Education 101 at one of the city colleges. I used the analogy of a salad bowl. These were young 19 to 24-year-olds going into education. And I used the analogy of a salad bowl to teach them about the importance of integrated education, mixing with all people. Because, sure, you can eat all the lettuce you want, it's good for you. If you mix in lettuce with some tomatoes, some cucumbers, some peppers, other spices and herbs, then you got a really good, healthy salad. So I would often use that analogy about education, the flavor mixing of groups of people. And I've always believed that it took a while to get to that point, but I believe the importance of people living together. And it's healthy.
Okay. And now across this country, depending upon whether it's a rural community, an urban community, and whether it's the north or the south or the east or the west, we still have, I'm going to use the term deserts in terms of where people are not seeing integration in their schools just because of the construction of the neighborhoods and where people live, right? There's going to be some neighborhoods that are majority Latino and they're all, going to school with majority Latino students. There's still neighborhoods majority Black. There's going to be some rural, neighborhoods or farm neighborhoods or whatever that also may not see much diversity in them. I don't necessarily know what the answer is for that, as a melting pot and this mixing bowl and this salad with all the different types of vegetables in it. But there are some spots that are still missing those other ingredients.
Well,
What's your comment? Yeah, on that.
if families choose to live in that setting, then that's their choice. But I would like to think that in use Chicago as an example, in a community where it's majority one ethnic group, but yet there's a public education system within that setting, then the staff, the teachers should be integrated. And the teachers should bring about experiences for those students. Of course, with the parents' approval, and you meet with another school, or you have friends that teach in another area that their students are majority one ethnic group and yours is another, then as an educator, you work on trying to integrate them to get to know each other. They may live in separate neighborhoods, separate households, separate upbringing, but there are some common things that we all have. So it's up to the educational system to kind of make that happen.
And I'll say for my children who were born in Chicago but raised in Minnesota, so we moved to Minnesota before they started preschool, even. The schools were integrated in the suburb that we still live in. But in terms of the teachers, so for my oldest son, Jarrett, his first non-white teacher or instructor, I can say, was not until he got to college. He had a black man for his statistics class. I remember him telling me, and that experience. There, there were other, I'm going to use the broader term, educators in the elementary school and in the high school. So some of them were the librarians or the school counselors or whatever else. But there were not many who were teachers. And and I know you mentioned earlier about, we choose to live in the neighborhoods we choose to live in. For some people, it's not entirely a choice where they're living, but yes, it was a choice where I was living, but not necessarily thinking about what the school was. You may, who's going to be teaching in the school. You're looking at maybe some test scores and wanting to be in certain school districts and certain schools within that school district. And I know today there's still this, I don't want to necessarily use the word struggle, but a push among educators and among higher ed and certain grant programs even, right, to bring more people of color in to become educators, and particularly also more Black men to become educators. We have a program here in Minnesota called Black Men Teach that's trying to get more Black men to become K through 12 educators. What, and again, you chose to be an educator. What can we do, you know, in terms of what educators should be thinking about in that regard? And I'm going to add one more element because I know when I look at with some of the school systems and they talk about wanting to have more teachers of color, they're still looking in certain neighborhoods, this urban neighborhood, that particular pocket where there's a high percentage of students of color and they need teachers who look like them. But yet you also have kids like my kids were in certain suburban areas that were integrated, but not a high percentage of certain students of color, that there did not seem to be that same kind of push of, oh, we should make sure there's more teachers of color over here in these schools because there's still students of color in those schools as well. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the educational system, those at the top, the school district leaders. I can give you an example of a suburban school district. The majority of the students are either Black or Hispanic, and 95% of the teaching staff, the leadership in the school are not of the same ethnicity. They are majority white. And so the school districts are at the top. And if they're not trying to integrate the teachers and the teaching staff and those, what can the parents say or do?
And some of this come about, who do we vote in to represent us on the school board? Because that's going to maybe make a difference in terms of how we view things. But also, I'm going to say at the state level and the federal level, again, when we're talking about some of these grant programs that help to bring more people into education as educators, because the view and the thought is that education doesn't pay as well, as a science field, a tech field, some other emerging technologies these days. And there's been like a decline in terms of the number of people who want to go into education. And thus also this increase of wanting people to get their degrees and become licensed teachers and programs to kind of help fund that. If you become a licensed teacher, we will forgive your student loans if you stay in this school district or stay within the profession for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be, depending upon the type of loan forgiveness program or other type of grant. So with the value that's placed on education and the need for quality teachers, and so outside of what the school board could maybe do and how the parents advocate, what might you put on the legislatures, the state government, the federal government?
And I think federal government, if the federal government is expressing a need for it, then the state will fall in line. It needs to come from the top. And I see a breakdown from what it was a few years back as far as government funding for education.
Mm. And this now kind of brings us full circle when I'm going back to the difference that Brown versus the Board of Education, and the difference that kind of made in 1954 with integrating schools. And that's not the only legislation, the only really lawsuit that kind of came and helped make a difference. But this is the type of impact, right? That when something's being done for the whole nation, that can make improvements for everyone.
But are we chipping away at that now?
We definitely know that there are issues now, but but to the point, right? We need stuff to come from the top.
From the top.
Yeah. What what would you want to leave us thinking about in terms of what else we can do from, again, when you look at your childhood to what's going on today, the education system that you had in the segregated South in the 1940s and 1950s, well, really the 1950s by the time you went to school, to today?
Well, I think my parents, their hands were tied in a way that parents' hands are not tied today. So it's going to take the voices of the parents to demand and we used to say walk the pavement. Let your voice be heard, and that's through voting, through knowing who you're putting in office. And you don't know if you don't get into the community and find out who's running for what office and what will they do for you and your community. Otherwise, we'll lose all that we have accomplished if your voice is not heard. And it does start at the bottom. Starts with the families, with the young adults. I was happy to see that some of them were walking the streets, walking that demanding from the government, from those in leadership. Your voice has to be heard.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mom. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me in this format. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for asking me, and I'm so happy and proud of what you're doing. Continue the good work.
and we will find a way to do this again on another topic at some future point.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening today. I'm Sheree Curry, and this has been This Conversation Matters on Power 104.7, supporting the mission of the Minnesota chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. Follow us on Instagram at NABJMN and me at Sheree Curry Media. And be sure to subscribe wherever you find your podcasts. Let's keep the conversation going.
Hello, I'm Kennedy, and every week we take you beyond the story, an NABJ Minnesota program brought to you by All About the Culture and Power 104.7.FM. Beyond the Story introduces you to business owners, community leaders, and media professionals. Join us after This Conversation Matters for Beyond the Story. Today on Beyond the Story, former Teen Vogue editor-in-chief Elaine Welteroth talks about the non-traditional ways a journalist can use their skill set.
Hopefully, a hopeful note to leave you guys on is, if you love to write and if journalism is your passion, just know that there are so many different ways that you can exercise that muscle. It does not necessarily have to come through this traditional path where an editor from a big newspaper or magazine is going to hire you and give you these, assignments and these beats. You guys can start. We talked about Substack, but you guys can start nonprofits. You guys can work for nonprofits. I mean, the skill set of a journalist is like gold in these times, that skill set. So I want to encourage you guys to get creative with what you know and what you can do, and don't put yourself in a box.
I'm Kennedy, and this has been Beyond the Story, a project associated with This Conversation Matters and the Minnesota chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists.